Welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're unpacking a truly monumental shift in American history that went down between 1800 and 1848. You know, we usually think of revolutions as wars fought with muskets and cannons, right? But what we're looking at today is a domestic revolution, a total, ground-up rewiring of the American economy, society, and landscape. It essentially created the modern nation, but, as we'll see, it also set the stage for its greatest crisis.
Think about this crazy contrast happening in just a single generation. Back in 1800, if you needed a shirt, a tool, or just some dinner, you likely grew it, spun it, or forged it yourself in a self-sufficient farming household. But fast forward to 1848, that exact same geographic space was crisscrossed with canals and railroads. You were probably working for wages, and the shoes you wore or the chair you sat in were manufactured in a factory miles away by someone you'd literally never met.
So here's our roadmap for today. 1. The transportation revolution. 2. The cotton paradox. 3. The rise of wage labor. 4. The new social order. And 5. Interdependence and division.
At its core, the market revolution was this massive pivot from household production to participating in regional and national markets. Sure, it was driven by shiny new transportation and tech, but it absolutely wasn't just an economic event. It completely remade class structures, redefined gender roles, created brand new forms of urban poverty, right alongside middle-class comfort, and severely sharpened regional differences. Let's dig into exactly how that happened.
All right, part 1. The transportation revolution, smashing the barrier of distance.
The United States was huge, and its interior was bursting with natural resources. The problem? Moving goods over land was prohibitively expensive. Imagine trying to ship a single ton of freight from Buffalo to New York City. In 1817, doing that by wagon cost $100 and took 3 agonizing weeks. But by 1825, using the newly built Erie Canal, that exact same freight moved by water for just $4, and it got there in 8 days. That 95% cost reduction wasn't just, convenient. It was a structural transformation of the entire economy. The Erie Canal was literally an engineering marvel. Stretching 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, it used 83 locks to raise boats over 500 feet across the rough Appalachian terrain. Championed by New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, skeptics originally mocked it as Clinton's big ditch. But guess what? Within a single decade, it had paid back its entire construction cost in tolls. It totally destroyed the economic isolation of the interior, funneling Ohio wheat and Indiana pork straight to New York City and officially turning it into the nation's dominant commercial hub.
But canals were just the warm-up act. The railroad age exploded right on its heels, from the Baltimore and Ohio kicking off in 1830 to over 9,000 miles of track by 1850. Railroads introduced a completely new spatial logic to the country. They could go where canals couldn't, they ran year-round because they didn't freeze over, and they demanded immense resources like iron and steel. They even forced the creation of standardized time zones to replace local solar time, just to keep the trains on schedule.
Moving on to part 2, the cotton paradox, the high cost of King Cotton. Now, while the North was busy building canals, railroads, and factories, the South was doubling down on a very different path, creating almost a parallel universe. I want you to ponder a really devastating paradox. Why would mechanizing a task, making it infinitely easier and faster to do with a machine, make the brutal institution of slavery expand on a massive scale rather than fade away?
The answer lies with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, patented in 1793. Before this little machine, a single enslaved worker could separate seeds from about 1 pound of short staple cotton per day. It was incredibly tedious. The gin mechanized that labor-intensive process, rocketing the output to 50 pounds per day. But here's the catch. By making cotton wildly profitable to cultivate on a massive scale, it didn't replace enslaved labor. It vastly expanded the demand for it, locking the Southern economy entirely into a plantation system.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of this shift, in 1790, the entire American South produced roughly 3,000 bales of cotton. Fast forward to 1860, that output had exploded to 4.5 million bales. It's an almost unimaginable leap. By the 1840s, this king cotton economy accounted for more than half the value of all American exports. Southern planters weren't investing in factories or banks. They were pouring all their capital into acquiring more land and more enslaved human beings. And this brings us to a deeply tragic reality of the market revolution. Because the international slave trade was banned in 1808, a massive internal commercial system developed to meet the demand. Between 1820 and 1860, Roughly 700,000 enslaved people were commodified and moved from the Upper South down to the Deep South. Families were permanently torn apart, and communities were destroyed as the market applied its brutal logic of supply and demand to human lives.
Let's turn to Part 3, Rise of Wage Labor, the Lowell System. Meanwhile, back up in New England, merchant capitalists known as the Boston Associates were funding an industrial revolution of their own, centered entirely on textile manufacturing. In 1822, they set up the Lowell Mill System. At first, it was celebrated as this highly benevolent setup. Young women from local farms, the mill girls, lived in company boarding houses, worked long hours, but also attended lectures and read poetry. But that didn't last. By the 1830s, owners started cutting wages and forcing workers to tend more machines at much faster paces. The women organized and actually went on strike in 1834 and 1836. Eventually, though, they were replaced in the 1840s by desperate Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine. The market revolution had effectively birthed a permanent, propertyless proletariat working class in America.
Which leads us directly to Part 4, the new social order, class and comfort.
So sitting right between those exceptionally wealthy mill owners and the propertyless factory workers, a brand new social strata was emerging in northern cities. We're talking about a new salaried middle class of clerks, managers, and lawyers. And they did something novel. They physically separated their homes from their workplaces. With this separation came a new ideological framework called the cult of domesticity. It essentially assigned men to the harsh, competitive public market and relegated women to a private, domestic sphere focused on the home and moral cultivation. While it supposedly elevated a woman's moral status, it completely confined her legally and economically. Married women couldn't even own property or vote.
This new middle-class identity became defined almost entirely by consumption and respectability. If you had a carpeted parlor, a mass-produced piano in the corner, and a wife who's free from physical labor, well, you had made it. However, it's absolutely vital to note what subsidized this rising northern prosperity. This comfortable middle-class life rested entirely on a foundation of cheap goods, specifically the cheap cotton produced by Southern slavery and the cheap cloth made by the harsh labor of northern factory workers.
Finally, Part 5, Interdependence and Division, the Breaking Point. When you zoom out, the market revolution ultimately produced three incredibly distinct regional economies. The Northeast became this dense hub for manufacturing and finance. The South specialized entirely in slave-grown staples like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. And the West produced grain, livestock, and raw materials. They were completely distinct, yet deeply interconnected.
It created a massive, tangled web of reliance. Think about it. The Northeast needed Southern cotton for its textile mills and Western wheat to feed its growing, crowded cities. The South desperately needed Northern credit to finance its ever-expanding plantations, plus Northern manufactured goods just to function. And the West? They needed those dense Eastern city markets to sell their agricultural surplus. They all absolutely needed each other to survive, but in the process, they developed completely opposing labor systems and political interests.
So the big takeaway here is that we absolutely cannot view the market revolution merely as a boring shift in how goods were bought and sold. Economic change and social change moved together, hand in hand. It was a total societal overhaul. It created the industrial working class, birthed the salaried middle class, entrenched the cult of domesticity, and vastly deepened the racial stratification at the very heart of the Southern plantation economy. It hardened economic regional logic into fierce political sectionalism. I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. If the market revolution successfully wove America's economy together into this highly productive, interdependent machine, why did it ultimately tear the nation apart? The fascinating and deeply tragic answer is that the very market forces that forged this American interdependence produced the exact structural conditions opposing labor systems and fierce regional loyalties that made the impending Civil War almost inevitable. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope it brought this massive, complex revolution into clear focus for you.